invite our panelists for the next session on stage. Dr. S Narayan, Professor Wu Yanrui, Dr. Biswajit Dhar. This session is moderated by Dr. S Narayan, Head of Research and Visiting Senior Research Fellow at ISAS. Over to you, Dr. Narayan.
Thank you, Gloria. I think we are just following up on the discussions that have been concluded in the earlier session here. And in this session, hopefully we'll be looking at the opportunities for regional and global cooperation between, not just between India and China, but the India and China together acting in concert for global cooperation. And we have two very, very distinguished panelists here. And first, we have Professor Wu Yanrui, Department of Economics on the Business School at the University of Western Australia, Perth, who will be talking to us about the economic links between the Asian giants, Shenzhen and outlook, and we'll be going historically at the kind of trade links that have established and making some predictions about the opportunities for the future. So, Professor, request you to
let's say an invisible hand guiding me the slides over there. Thank you, Chair, and thanks also go to the organizers, ISAS, for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity to address this audience. I'm an economist by training, so my focus pretty much on the economic issues, in particular the economic links between the two giants in Asia, China, and India. So I'm going to go through a couple of points very briefly, given the time limit. In particular, I have two objectives in my talk. First one is to just go through quickly the trends of economic links between the two countries, in particular in the last decades. And then I'm going to shed some light on the prospects of future development in the two countries, particularly the links between the two countries. Very briefly, a little bit background on the economic development, economic growth in the two countries over the two decades. We all know that China and India are two great countries in the world, and the two countries have achieved a lot in the last decades. As I said, I'm economists, economists like to use figures to deliver our points. So, as you can say, it doesn't matter whether we look to country in terms of economic growth rates, capital income, or indicators in other areas of the country have achieved a lot. The keynote speaker this morning mentioned China had hit about 10 years or so, has done much better in many areas. But in terms of GDP per capital, either in US dollar terms or in so-called PPP, purchasing power parity terms, both countries have now fallen into the rank of middle-income countries according to the World Bank classification. India probably falls into the lower middle-income category, China the upper middle-income category, all fall in the same category, the so-called middle-income. There's no debate about the so-called middle-income trap, and that's something I'm not going to talk about today. Now, the economic growth for 2 or 3 decades has changed the two countries dramatically. I use the word transformation of the two economies, as you can see from those figures. In terms of economic structure, those numbers are percentage shares of GDP in the two countries. Over three sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. I don't know if you can see the numbers on the screen or not. It's a big room with a very small screen. Just a couple points. 30 years ago, two countries started with similar structures. Agriculture accounted for about 1/3 of their economies, with the status industrial sector in China is similar to the status of services in India 30 years ago. Now, 30 years on, in 2011, last year, we see the huge changes, basically the decline of agriculture as a share of GDP in the two economies. In the case of China, only agriculture only accounts for 1/10 of the economy. India, less than 10%. The major difference between the two economies is really the role of industry and services in the two economies. This audience probably is well known about the success of the service sector in India. So last year, it accounts for more than half of the Indian economy, so 56%. And then the major point is really this very small role of industry sector by the Indian economy. I'm going to talk about a bit more on this, the difference between industrialization policies and the service sector development in the two economies. Now, as just mentioned, the two countries are great nations in the world. They have their glorious days in the past. Those numbers are based on the estimates by economic historians and Madison. They estimate the income share of the two countries in the world. It goes back to a long time in the history. Say, I have a number here from the 15th century with particular numbers to the next 2 decades. As you can see, in the 15th century, the two countries together counted for half of the world's entire income, or 50%. And then in around the 17th century, 18th century, the two countries started declining. India started early, around the 17th century, and then China in the early 18th century. So we call it the falling giants in the last 1 or 200 years. Then their status fall to the pretty much bottom about 50, 60 years ago, and then only started recovering in recent decades. A few comments on the similarities and difference between the two countries. Previous speakers this morning already presented quite a lot on the similarity, commonality shared with two countries. In recent decades, on the economic front, the both countries initiated economic reforms began in the 80s and then followed in the 1990s. I guess the probably more serious reforms were introduced in China in the 80s, and then there are some initiatives were adopted in India as well in the 80s. But in more recent decades, two major events: the introduction of new industrial policies in India in the beginning of the 19th century, then China, the famous South China Tool made by Chinese former leader Deng Xiaoping in 1992. Those are very two important points of division in recent history, because the major reform policies were introduced after 1992 in China, similarly in India after 1991. Now, both countries share something that's economic openness, probably more so in the last decade in China. So the openness policy was formally endorsed in China in the early 1990s, but probably more recently in India. I can show you some figures here. This one shows the total trade volume in the two countries. The left-hand side are numbers refer to China. the right-hand side refers to India. As you can see, was already mentioned this morning, there's about 2 years difference in two countries in terms of economic policies and economic development. If we look at the trade figures, it's very clear here. As you can see, in 2011, the total trade volume in India was around about $800 billion. Well, that figure was achieved 10 years ago in China, so around 800 on the left-hand side. So it's a gap for 2 years. In terms of FDI, there's some difference too. Now, if we look to the volumes here, China has achieved the same status as India reached last year, about 2 decades ago. So there's a minor difference in terms of foreign direct investment into two countries. Now, as far as trade is concerned, a 10 years gap, and FDI about 20 years. Thank you. Now, economists use the ratio of trade over GDP as an indicator of economic openness. The interesting finding in this figure here, the blue one is China, the red one is India. The two countries actually, as far as degree of openness is concerned, the two countries are converging in recent decades. As you can see, the two lines about to meet last year. If we can also examine the ratio of foreign direct investment over GDP, as you can see, the last year, the two figures were in the case of India, just under 2%, and China, look at the left-hand side, close to 2% too. So, although they started very differently with a huge gap between the two countries, but in recent years, the trend is emerging, it's converging the two countries. Now, that's the similarities in economic development, in trade, and so on. The two countries also have some interesting difference on the economic front. The keynote speaker also mentioned this morning was really the role of state-owned enterprises in China, while the private sector is very active in India. So it's really a single digital sector in the two countries, SOEs in China, private firms in India. Then the second point I want to highlight is the industrialization in China, or the service revolution in India, and this is another difference in the two countries. Well, I highlight those are the difference in the two countries. These are also potential areas of expanded cooperation in the two countries. So I will come back to this point again. The next point I'm going to focus on the links between the two countries. It's really the core of my talk. The economic links have expanded a lot in the two countries, so it's expanded rapidly, as you can say. This depends on how you measure the numbers, how you get the numbers. I use the number from the Reserve Bank of India. The red line is India's exports to China and imports from India. You can see a huge gap between the two in favor of China in the last decade in particular. The red one is input and the blue one is export. The gap's getting bigger in recent years. So during the financial year 2011-2012, China became India's largest trading partner. In the meantime, India was only China's 11th largest trading partner. So it's a huge gap to catch up India. China's exports dominated by manufactured goods, particularly machinery and transport. Indian exports are still dominated by more raw material, but which comes from 70% manufactured goods, less than 30%. I have more numbers to look at the trade shares by different commodity groups and also the intensity. Basically, figures shows Indian exports underperform, exports to China underperform, and Chinese imports from India underperform. These are really two areas the two countries, policymakers in particular, have been addressing in the coming decades. Professor Gould from from Shanghai just mentioned that those dialogue mechanism, I think that this is one of the areas they have to fix it because this huge deficits it's not sustainable in the long run. Also have numbers in the table about the intra-industry trade. Intra-industry trade is really referring to trade of goods in the same industry rather than trade of goods across industry. There's difference to highlight here. In some areas there's quite a bit of activities, in other areas there's very little. So we can also talk quite a bit about the competition between the two countries, collaboration. The economists also use numbers to show the areas which the two countries may be competing, but there are many areas the two countries can complement each other. So this is less competition. Bilateral investment is an area which has a lot of potential for expansion. Currently, China has invested about under $1 billion in India, even less in China. So given the size of the two economies and the economic activities of the two countries, these numbers are very, very small, very, very little. So a lot can be done to expand bilateral investment in the two countries. In terms of links beyond international trade, previous two speakers have talked quite a bit about the law of international relationships. I'm not going to skip this different dialogue in different areas, different grouping, different mechanisms. In terms of international cooperation, some of the names already mentioned, but in G20, BRICS, East Asian Summit, United Nations, and so on. So, briefly on the outlook, Swami session to finish. The two countries can enjoy growth and prosperity through competition as well as collaboration. All those numbers can point to this direction. There are complementarities between the two countries. India, there's a lot of scope for manufacturing expansion, while China has still an underdeveloped service sector, particularly new services, not traditional services like restaurants and so on. The new services really referring to IT, to banking and finance and so on. This probably the last table, very interesting, there's some very interesting numbers here, really put China, India in comparative perspective with other major economies, the US and Japan. As you can say, as the economy develops, become mature over time, those numbers are shares of employment and income in the three sectors. Shares of income of employment and digit income are more or less the same in each sector, but there's a huge gap between China and India, so it's still a long way for the two countries to catch up. Without look at these numbers here, the GDP agriculture, so in the case of US, 1.2, employment 1.6, while China and India, the share of agricultural income is declining, but the employment share is still very high. Now, in the case, I promise to come back to service in India, so it's a huge share in GDP, while employment is relatively small. So some scholars argue that maybe in India you can continue to develop the services and then become rich. I doubt about that, because what about there's still so many workers to get a job. If you don't expand manufacturing, then many people will don't have a job. Same with China, manufacturing keeps expanding, but the share of jobs is limited. There's a limit. So the final solution for China is to expand services to create more jobs. So trade between the two countries will continue to expand, and the trade imbalance has to be resolved over time, and that's getting very serious as the gap is getting larger and larger. The major point of growth in the future for India is manufacturing. China, it's really services. For the Indian case in particular, the countries should figure out a way to lot of market access for Indian IT and pharmaceutical and so on. Those are really the areas Indian companies have comparative advantage. There's great potential for bilateral investment. For example, China is undergoing through an industrial upgrading at the moment. Also, there's a lot of capital for investment overseas. I think if India could tap into these policy changes in China to benefit from that. I think that's what we can say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, very much, Professor. Actually, that's a very, very good and comprehensive, I would say, narrative of the similarities as well as the, would call it the time gap differences in the growth of the two countries in economic terms. And it's very interesting to see that if you take care of the time gap of about 15 or 20 years between the opening up of the two countries, there are a lot of similarities that have been found in the graphs. At the same time, that gives rise to a number of opportunities as well. What is really interesting in the last table, as you would have noticed, is that the kind of labor productivity that is coming out in the last table in manufacturing in China is coming out to be so much more than India. Whereas in the services sector, the contribution, the value addition in India is coming out to be so much more in those last numbers. It's very interesting to see this. And perhaps here lies a story of an opportunity for cooperation. But without going into this in further debate, now we have with us Dr. Biswajit Dhar. Biswajit Dhar, an old friend, a major economist, written substantially and extensively on all matters, particularly related to international trade. Now he is the Director General of RIS, which is the Research and Information System for developing countries in Pakistan.
Ambassador Delay, S Narayan, and distinguished delegates. At the outset, I'd like to thank ISAS for inviting me to this very important dialogue on India-China cooperation in regional and global arenas. Now, in the morning we heard our guest of honor, Mr. Wu Yanrui, and talk about the importance of India and China in driving the global economy. In fact, other distinguished speakers also mentioned this fact. What we have been seeing in the last decade in particular is that the center of gravity of the global economy is shifting away from the advanced countries. And if you look at what the Goldman Sachs had predicted about the rise of the BRIC in the early part of last decade, the rise of China and India have far exceeded the predictions that Goldman Sachs had made then. India and China, together with the other countries in the East Asian region, are becoming ever so relevant in the global economy, and this has been proved in the events in the aftermath of the most recent downturn that the global economy has had experienced, where these two countries were able to withstand the problems that were brought in by the global financial crisis. And what we also found is that the other countries in the East Asian region rebounded much faster than expected. So the stability, whatever little was provided in the aftermath of the downturn, was provided by these countries. Now the key question that arises here is that how have China and India been able to utilize their growing economic influence to change the discourse in the critical international forums? and here I'm going to look at only at the economic forums and how these different forums which are providing the wherewithal of the global economic governance are being shaped up by these two countries, the two growing economic powers. Now, as we all know that the global institutions, particularly in the areas of trade and finance, have been dominated by the advanced countries. Professor Narayan mentioned this in his extremely lucid presentation. And these advanced countries have used their economic clout to actually dominate these institutions. They have also been coordinating their efforts, and something which is very interesting for us to recognize, that they've used forums such as the OECD and later the G7 to really shape these institutions for meeting their long-term economic aspirations. Now, while these countries have been, the small quantity of these countries have been dominating these institutions, the inevitable happened, which is that these institutions have suffered the democratic deficit. They have been ignoring the roles that they had to play in as development institutions, and they had thus put aside the needs of the lesser developed countries. Now, the last decade has shown that some changes are in the offing, and here India and China are playing their parts in altering the dynamics of some of these international organizations. And I'm going to just give a brief account of how things are happening. But let me also mention here that most of these initiatives are still in the works and much more need to be done, and therefore we need to understand how we cooperate with each other to change the dynamics of these institutions. The first is in the realm of the reform of the international financial institutions. Now again, as we know that India and China have moved in unison to see how the two countries and the developing country group as a whole have a larger share in the running of the institutions. And one of the ways in which this can happen is through the increase in quota and the voting shares of these countries. Now, through the efforts that these countries have put together in the last few years, in 2008 there was a decision which was arrived at in the IMF, where the voting shares would be changed, and this we are going to see the evidence of it next year. But of course there are indications, recent indications are there that there have been disagreements between the US and the EU, and quite naturally so, they would not like to yield the power that they had in these institutions on the methodology to change the shareholding pattern. So here I think there is some work that the two countries need to do to get the things going. Now, I would say that the reform of the international financial institutions is really the first step towards addressing the issue of macroeconomic management. In the past, the burden of adjustment following global economic crisis inevitably fell on the developing countries. So this happened in the 80s, after the Great Debt crisis. It had happened in the 90s. And many developing countries after the debt crisis in the 80s were put under the structural adjustment programs, and which have had severe impact on the development trajectories. The logical next step, in my view, is the management of the global capital markets, where I think these two countries, India and China, need to play a part, which, as the past experience has shown us since the Lehman collapse, need structural reforms. Ever since the debt crisis in the 1980s, there have been talk of improving the regulatory supervision of the banking sector. But the experience that we have had with the implementation of the Basel norms on capital adequacy and trying to bring better more transparency in the functioning of the banking sector. It's shown that more efforts need to be put in by the emerging economies in this area too. Because again, the Western financial centers are unwilling to make the necessary changes. Now, while I would say that some of these areas, in the global financial, inform the global financial institutions, these are still work under progress. India and China can, I think, take more heart from the fact that they, along with some of the other emerging countries, were able to influence, to an extent, the dynamics of the multilateral trade negotiations. Again, Professor S Narayan mentioned this, and also Mr. Go mentioned this about how the WTO is now one of the focus areas of these institutions. And in the ongoing Doha round of negotiations, we have found that there's been an emergence of a new quad. The first four countries in the earlier CAT, there used to be the US, EU, Japan, and Canada, who were influencing the outcomes of the multilateral trade negotiations. But now we have had, since China joined the WTO in 2002, the emergence of the new quad, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, which are trying to ensure that the development dimensions which are inherent in the Doha Development Agenda are implemented, particularly in the area of agriculture and health. Again, past speakers have mentioned this. I think these are two areas where the way India and China have negotiated with the United States and the European Union, who have had this stranglehold over the agricultural sector, is quite significant, because they have given leadership to a whole host of countries in Africa in particular, which have suffered because of a very unequal agreement on agriculture that was negotiated in the way round. And fundamental changes were therefore being pushed for in the Doha round. And that, of course, led to one of the major problems in the Doha round, the impasse that we are seeing now. Also in the area of health, bringing in the important recognition that the intellectual property regime cannot be antithetical to the global health needs is something that India and China have been emphasizing in these negotiations. I would say that the challenge that these countries have is to ensure that the integrity of the multilateral trading system is maintained, so that it delivers on the commitment to provide a non-discriminatory trading regime that is supportive of the development aspirations of the lesser players in the global system. Now, we've also heard about the area of climate change, where the basic countries, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, have tried to meet the challenge to get an equitable outcome that is supportive of the development needs. Now, finally, I would like to talk about, for a minute that I have with me, on the increasing relevance of BRICS. And I quite agree with other speakers who mentioned that this whole dynamics of the BRICS is being led by India and China. And one particular issue on which there's been a lot of traction between two countries is on the BRICS Development Bank. Now, as you all know, that the world of development cooperation is now in a big melting pot. And what we saw last year in Busan, in the high-level forum on aid effectiveness, we found that the discourse of development cooperation had moved away from aid effectiveness to development partnership and effectiveness of development partnership. Now, it's one thing to provide a framework, but it is also very important to provide the backup, financial support that is needed to run this new philosophy. And India and China, as the new players on the development cooperation area, can ideally provide the traction in this regard. The BRICS development idea, bank idea, was conceived of in the New Delhi summit. We're still trying to work out how this is going to play itself out. But I would say that this particular idea and others that are were agreed to in the New Delhi summit will show quite clearly that what was being questioned as formation, the BRICS, not too long back, is now becoming one of the most important forums where India, China, along with other emerging countries, can make a real difference to the global economy. Finally, I would say that the basic structure that India and China need to work on is that they need to strengthen the multilateral system of economic governance, and which would be based on the principles of equity. Now, in the past, we have seen developing countries come up with this whole idea of an international economic order based on equity and justice. That couldn't be realized because they were not real players, they're not significant economic players on the global stage. But I think now the time has come where these countries, having reached a level of strength, or they have found their strengths, they can really influence the global processes more substantially. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Dr. Dhar's exposition has clearly pointed out the opportunities for regional cooperation, and particularly at multinational fora. And there are a number of areas where the two countries can be working together for advancing mutual interests. So we have two very interesting perspectives here. One on the area of trade and business, where what kind of common growth is possible. And the other in the area of, I would say, strategy, diplomacy, and international architecture, where again there are opportunities for the two countries to go together. So on this, I think I would like to open the floor for discussion. We do have about just under 20 minutes for questions. So may I just request, as usual, people to identify themselves and to tell us to which of the panelists they're interested in the question. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mr. Sabiza. I think as things stand right now, India's trade deficit with China is approximately about $25 billion US. And when I look at the trade pattern, I think the problem is more structural in the sense that raw materials take up 70% of India's exports to China. So frankly, this makes me wonder to what extent India can be quite successful in narrowing the trade gap in the long run. And how far India can be successful in penetrating the Chinese market, especially in the area of IT and pharmaceuticals. Thank you.
Can we take maybe one more question? Yes.
I'm Choi Hai. In my recent visits to South Asian countries, in my discussion with politicians and businessmen, the matter of Indian-Chinese cooperation and competition came up very frequently. As we know, India and China are both seeking and even competing for political diplomatic influence in some of these South Asian countries. There is also competition for economic influence. My question is this: are the two speakers aware of any cooperation and in fact joint ventures announced large Indian and Chinese companies in development projects in the third country, say in the infrastructure or development or in large tiny joint ventures. In the case of Myanmar, Myanmar is opening up. Myanmar has a lot of resources. It needs a lot of infrastructural developments. We see the possibility of large Indian and Chinese companies getting together because of the large investments required to develop those joint projects. And are you aware of any such joint ventures at the moment?
Thank you very much for the question. Very briefly to respond to the second question. Well, I don't have detailed information. If I recall correctly, there were reports in the media sometimes ago about Indian and Chinese companies form a team together to meet in certain countries. So, but I don't know the current state. I think there's something going on, but this should be encouraging. The first question on the trade deficits in favor of China at the moment. Well, I find that the gap is getting bigger and bigger, and something which has to be resolved. The two governments are aware of this, and that's why they form some kind of a dialogue to try to resolve this issue. But my guess is that it will not happen in the immediate, in the near future. It may last for a while. Because if we look at the development in China in the last 3 decades, say in the 80s, many companies from Southeast Asia, they moved to China and produced there. Then China enjoyed trade deficit with this region here for many years. But then over time, as the manufacturing activity expanded in China and they started exporting, then the deficit disappears gradually. Probably pretty much will happen to India too. So 2 points. One, the expansion of manufacturing activity in India is a very important issue. I already mentioned that India cannot rely on service market for modernization. India definitely needs manufacturing expansion, its industrialization. So the manufacturing activity in India itself will expand over time. In the meantime, if, say, for example, if India allows more foreign companies to produce in India, those companies may produce for local markets, but eventually they may produce for overseas markets. For example, the big Chinese companies, they are currently producing in China, exporting to India. Now, if those guys move to produce in India, initially they may produce for Indian market, but as the labor cost becomes more expensive in China, they probably eventually end up exporting to China, as they have done that in past for Southeast Asian companies, for Japanese companies, for Korean companies. They get the same. So the deficit will not disappear immediately. It takes time. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out that Professor Wu mentioned that India will have to look at manufacturing as the way forward. Because, last year, our finance minister had a target. Our manufacturing share of manufacturing in GDP is down to about 16%. What was mentioned about industry includes mining and other things. But manufacturing is down to 16%, and he had a target to increase the manufacturing share in GDP to 25% in the next 10 years. So quite clearly, India is looking towards increasing in the share of manufacturing. And more recently, those who have been following the changes in economic policies that have been before, there's been a great deal of emphasis on foreign direct investment. And here I would say that there is a great opportunity for China and India to do business in what we call investment-led trade. You know, as you mentioned, as Professor Wu Yanrui mentioned, that there will be Chinese investments in India, and we're seriously considering this. There will be Chinese investments in India. Part of it could be relocated as China becomes more, the labor becomes more expensive and source cheaper labor in India. And therefore, the shift that took place, earlier from Japan to Southeast Asia and created these global, the regional value chains, we are looking at the possibility of these value chains being extended to India being part of this value chain. Now, the good news in this whole thing is that the policymakers in both countries are worried about this trade deficit. There is a recognition that this trade deficit is unsustainable. So some of the things that we're discussing here could be actually translated sooner than later to address this problem of huge trade deficit. And therefore, possibilities of Indian manufacturers, I'm not talking about services alone, but Indian manufactured products manufactured in India, penetrating into China, not too long in the future. The second issue on India-China joint ventures, there have been a lot of examples actually around the world, and most of these have been in the area of exploration. India and China have jointly bid in Africa. They have a considerable number of blocks where they have actually bid together in Latin American region. But there was an attempt to do a similar thing in Myanmar, but of course there was a problem there. But as the questioner rightly mentioned, that Myanmar is offering a huge opportunity for the two countries to really come together, and this is also fits very well into India's larger policy of the East. We are trying to really strengthen our links, and in terms of building the physical infrastructure, the connectivity, and also the virtual links. So I think there are big opportunities that are waiting to be exploited, and where India and China can jointly work for the regional good and trying to sort of bring development to this region.
Particularly in the energy sector, as Dr. Dhar said, there are opportunities for both countries to work together, especially since they are looking at similar expectations of exploiting the natural resources and bringing them over to their own countries. I also know that in Australia, the state-owned Chinese company as well as Indian companies are working together to form common infrastructure in order to bring coal out of Queensland. Can we move on? Maybe the next set of questions. I saw some hands. Yes, please.
What is the underlying barriers that result in such slower GDP growth between China and India as compared to ASEAN and India or ASEAN and China? Okay, this is my first question, and regarding the second question is from the past, from your presentation, in the past, the deficit could be due to China's development, rapid economic growth, more natural resources being imported from India itself. That could be one of the reasons why China actually resulted in such a trade deficit. So what in the past, because China is rapidly growing, the economy is 10% or higher developing. So now China's economy is going to the trend of maturity below 8%. So what do you have in your view that in terms of the trends and outlook, will such a deficit be balanced or balanced? Because these natural resources may have a slower demand. Okay. And what should be, is there any new emerging opportunities that can also balance such trade deficit? Thanks.
Do we take one more? There are any? Yes, please.
Just now, I think Dr. Wu, you mentioned about the trade intensity between China and India was low. Also, the investment, foreign direct investments between the two have been low. So, what do you think are the compelling reasons for India and China to cooperate in the area of trade and investment? Because you can see, I mean, in intra-Asia, trade itself is basically on intermediary products. And as you have shown in your statistics, India, in terms of as a manufacturing base, still has a long way to go. And then, of course, at the same time, you look at the tariff regime of India, still very high tariffs. There's still a lot of high tariffs. So I'm wondering, what would be the compelling reason for China and India to work together on economic issues? Second, I also see India is now looking more and more towards the east, and you have also the South Asia region there, and you have a regional organization there, SAARC. So how do you think India's future strategy is going to be in South Asia, especially, in particular SAARC as a regional organization there? And third, I think is on I think both speakers did not mention about infrastructure, because I think that is one of the reasons why China is more successful today, I would say. What is India doing about infrastructure? Because I think that's going to be very important if you want to become a manufacturing or a factory for Asia.
Thank you very much for the questions. I don't think I've answered all the questions. This is a very great comment on this. A couple of points I want to draw your attention to. Now, not a long time ago, China was actually exporting raw materials to Japan, to other countries. So if now China exported oil, coal to Japan, it only stopped in recent years. So in that sense, probably India is doing the same things as China did 10 years ago. So currently, India's trade relies on exporting raw materials, not as much export. So you don't have to worry. It's economics, so it's a fixed question. The second point I want to emphasize that you correctly, rightly, tariff rate in India are still relatively high. So there's still scope for further liberalization. That's something economists cannot fix, and policymakers probably can play a big role to lower the tariff rate or completely remove these tariff rate and non-tariff barriers to trade and investment, and to improve infrastructure development. On an outside point again, a couple of big companies in China that contribute to like the Huawei and other telecommunication companies. So the correct thing to do is allow them to produce in India. They may say initially 3-5 years for local markets, and then eventually as their scale expands, they definitely have to start exporting to China or to the Western region. Now in the case of China, China enjoyed success in exporting. But keep in mind, half of China's exports has been done by foreign companies, not locals. By Japanese companies from OECD countries, they account for more than half of China's total export. So to narrow the gap, you really have to allow more foreign companies to produce, and they then export onto behalf of India. Thank you.
Again, sort of equal the same sentiment that what the numbers that Professor Wu mentioned were from the past, and of course we recognize that there was a big deficit, because what he mentioned was that India is not competitive in manufacturers, so that's a fact of life. The point is that how do we change this entire scenario, and is it possible to change the scenario, and is it possible to bring a cooperation to change the scenario? And the answer is yes, because there is inclination on both sides to really change this issue. Now, I would say that on the question of tariffs, I would say that as far as the industrial sector is concerned, in India, tariffs is not a big issue, because the average tariffs are down to below 10% now. But the real problem is in the area of other the trade facilitation issues. What World Bank calls the ease of doing business. But there, India has a problem. We recognize that this is becoming a major bottleneck. And but again, the policymakers are mindful of the fact that you need investments to turn things around. And in terms of creating infrastructure in these areas, the logistical services, port facilities, again, things are happening. But I would also say here that with our own efforts, we really can't do as much as we would have been able to do with the help of foreign investment coming here. And again, that goes back to the point I made earlier, that there is a recognition that we on our own really can't do much, and there is a need for foreign participation to really help us achieve what we're aspiring to.
Thank you, and I think we have, it's showing me the sign that time's up. So I think what we have is a perspective which is a perspective of opportunity. Certainly in India there are difficulties, as you said, of doing business or starting business, but there's an opportunity of expanding the manufacturing base. There's an opportunity of doing trade together or business together. And there's an opportunity for getting together for regional cooperation, for acting together in international forum. So on this kind of positive note, I would like to bring this session to a close and thank our two panelists for absolutely excellent presentations.
Dr. Narayan will present tokens of appreciation to the speakers. Professor Wu Yanrui. Dr. Biswajit Dhar. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall break for lunch now. The buffet lunch is at Ballroom 2, which is just next to where we are now. Both vegetarian and non-vegetarian dishes are available. Just a gentle reminder to drop your completed conference and evaluation forms in the feed box on your way out. Feedback box on your way out. Our second session will begin by 2 p.m., so please kindly wrap at that time. We would also like to inform you that the dialogue with Mr. Jairam Ramesh, which is scheduled for tomorrow at 2:30 p.m., is cancelled due to unforeseen circumstances. We apologize for the inconvenience. However, the morning session with Ambassador Jay Shankar will take place as scheduled. Enjoy your lunch.